Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I welcome you to the last talk in this series organized by the Hellenic Center in collaboration with the Greek Lab of the University of Patras. My name is Katerina Oikonomopoulou. I am an assistant professor of classics at the University of Patras. My topic today is epidemic diseases and their social impact in ancient Greece. Epidemic diseases, as we know, have been present throughout recorded history. Historians attribute their rise to the adoption of agriculture and the growth of urban settlements in the first millennia BC. It is now understood that both developments brought humans and animals into close proximity, with the inevitable result that germs could now easily jump the species barrier and spread widely across populations. Most, if not all, of the epidemic diseases that we know of today, such as smallpox, mumps, the flu, and many others, originated in this process. The presence of epidemic diseases in the Greek world of classical and Greco-Roman antiquity is well attested in our sources. My aim today will be to discuss how these sources present the social impact of epidemic disease. In other words, how they treat epidemic disease as a factor which disturbs or disrupts social cohesion by raising questions about cause, blame, and responsibility, and also by offering us glimpses of the mental and emotional state of those involved. There are three main types of sources on epidemic disease in the ancient Greek world: medical texts, historiography and biography, and literary genres such as epic and tragedy. In this talk, I will mainly be covering the first two. Each type of text offers a different perspective on epidemic disease. Medical texts, for example, list symptoms and treatments, they classify diseases, they discuss the role and responses of the doctors and their patients. Historiography and biography next. These genres usually treat epidemic disease only when it makes a significant impact on certain historical developments. For example, the outcome of certain wars, whether it has an impact on diplomatic relationships between states, and so on. It is these texts specifically that also seek to trace the impact of epidemic disease on individual character, on morale, and they seek to understand how epidemic disease affects the relationship between leaders and their subjects. Epic and drama, last, they treat epidemic disease as a fictional device in order to problematize the social consequences of personal responsibility. Such texts are famously Homer's Iliad and Sophocles' Oedipus the King. If one reads the openings of these texts, the first lines of each work, both begin with a plague, a mysterious disease that afflicts, in the case of Homer, a whole army, the Greek army. In the case of Sophocles, in Oedipus the King, it afflicts an entire city, the city of Thebes. In both cases, these plagues are the result of actions committed by individuals. In the case of Homer, the person to blame is Agamemnon. In the case of Sophocles, the person to blame is Oedipus himself, the king of Thebes. Despite these differences, when epidemic diseases do occur in all these different types of texts, they always raise difficult questions. And the three main questions are the following: why do epidemic diseases occur? Who or what is to blame, and what should be done? These in turn prompt further questions which concern the relationship between humans and their gods, the role of political leadership, when it comes to doctors who are called to treat diseases, to treat patients. There's a question of personal responsibility. Of course, the patient himself has a role to play in this, in responding to treatment or in following a doctor's instructions. And of course, the last and perhaps most important question is how society should respond to an outbreak of an epidemic disease as a whole. We will follow some of the answers by looking at specific texts. The first of these texts is the Epidemics. It is in this text that the earliest descriptions of epidemic diseases occur in the corpus of Greek literature. The Epidemics is the ancient world's earliest collection of medical case studies. It consists of 7 books, which in antiquity were attributed to the famous doctor Hippocratic from the island of Kos. We know today, however, that they were probably written by different authors, all of whom were traveling physicians in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. What makes this collection particularly remarkable is its geographical and social scope. It covers peripheral Greek communities beyond Athens and Sparta, which are the ones that are best attested in our sources. So communities about which we would otherwise know very little. It also describes the impact of disease not just on aristocrats, so the upper echelons of Greek society, but also on children, slaves, and women. Often the text has the form of notes, and despite the title Epidemics, epidemic diseases are actually not its exclusive topic. It covers a very wide range of diseases, not all of which are epidemic. One such peripheral community is the Greek island of Thasos in the northern Aegean. You can see the island on this map. It is situated here on the right-hand side near the peninsula of Chalkidike in modern Greece. This island features very prominently in the first book of the Epidemics. The first book describes in great detail all the types of epidemic diseases that regularly attacked this island's small community. The first book's opening reads as follows, and it is worth reading it and following the approach of the author himself. As he puts it, in Thasos during autumn, about the time of the equinox to near the setting of the Pleiades, this is a constellation, there were many rains, gently continuous with southerly winds. Winter southerly, north winds light, droughts. On the whole, the winter was like a spring southerly and chilly, slight showers, summer in general cloudy, no rain. It is clear from this text, from this opening, that the physician who wrote this text seeks to link the emergence of disease to the island's weather patterns. In an approach that is sometimes labeled as environmental medicine by scholars, the physician is an observer not just of physical symptoms, but also of weather patterns such as rains, winds, humid or dry conditions in the climate, etc. In the example here, the weather patterns that are described seem rather abnormal, given the island's geographical position. We know that in northern Greece, winters tend to be cold, whereas the summers are pretty hot. Here we read about an exceptionally mild winter, a rainy spring, and a cloudy summer. This succession of abnormal seasons then explains the emergence of various diseases in the population. The first disease in the document is described in remarkable detail in the following words. Many had swellings beside one ear or both ears, in most cases unattended with fever, so that confinement to bed was unnecessary. In some cases there was slight heat, but in all the swelling subsided without causing harm. In no case was there suppuration, such as attends swellings of other origin. This was the character of them, flabby, big, spreading, with neither inflammation nor pain. In every case, they disappeared without a sign. And the text concludes, the sufferers were youths, young men, and men in their prime, usually those who frequented the wrestling school and gymnasia. Few women were attacked. As the Oxford historian Robin Lane Fox, in his recent wonderful book on the invention of Greek medicine, comments, and here I will quote his words, manifestly the men of Thasos had caught mumps. The doctor, he adds, made an inadvertent contribution to social history. Boys and men in the wrestling schools and gyms were especially affected. They exercised naked, and their bodies came into close physical contact. contact. Girls and women were excluded. The word inadvertent is well chosen by Robin Lane Fox. This is because Hippocratic doctors are not normally concerned with the social aspects of disease and usually show no awareness that contagion is the factor that facilitates the spread of epidemic disease. Yet here, and I will go back to the text, yet here these doctors' observations allow us to link the spread of epidemic diseases to the social organization of ancient cities. On Thasos, and this was a situation that was probably the same in many other places in Greece, if not all, men lived a separate existence from the women, who were mostly confined in their homes and of course never exercised in public. Some of the island's women may well have caught mumps, but given their social isolation, the opportunities for the disease to spread among them through contagion were probably very limited. We know from the famous Hippocratic oath, which doctors still take today, the founders of the Hippocratic School of Medicine developed an ethical code as physicians. The books of the Epidemics allow us to gain a sense of the conditions and pressures under which this code was shaped. For example, in section 11 of book 1, we read, "Declare the past, diagnose the present, foretell the future, practice these acts. As to diseases, make a habit of two things, to help, or at least to do no harm. The art, that is the art of medicine, has three factors, the disease, the patient, the physician. The physician is the servant of the art. The patient must cooperate with the physician in combating the disease." This passage allows us to gauge how outbreaks of epidemic diseases, such as mumps, diseases that were not necessarily deadly, yet posed special challenges to physicians, so how such outbreaks formed a crucial backdrop to the formation of the Hippocratic Code of Professional Conduct. In trying to combat such diseases and heal large numbers of patients as effectively as possible, 5th century doctors in communities like Thasos were prompted to reflect on their duties as practitioners, on their responsibilities towards their patients, and on the importance of doctor and patient cooperation. Perhaps the most famous case of an epidemic disease in the classical world is the so-called Plague of Athens. It occurred in 430 BC, at a time when the city was at war with Sparta and its Peloponnesian allies. Thucydides, the historian who first recorded this plague in detail, says that the disease spread from a cargo ship which had arrived from Africa. He traces, in fact, the origin of this disease to Ethiopia. The disease claimed many victims. A very large proportion of Athens' population died as a result of it. One of these victims is an 11-year-old girl whose remains were found in a mass grave in the cemetery of Keramikos at Athens. The forensic archaeologists, pathologists, and orthodontists who have reconstructed her face from her skull have called her Myrtis. She's exhibited in the National Archaeological Museum of Athens and helps us put a face to the plague's many anonymous victims. It seems, according to the forensic experts, that Myrtis died of typhoid fever, though the evidence is not conclusive. The debate about what the Athenian plague, about what disease the Athenian plague actually was, is still ongoing, and there have been many suggestions. It may have been typhus, typhoid fever, hemorrhagic fever, and many others. I will here discuss a text that features much less prominently in discussions of the Athenian plague, so not Thucydides, but Plutarch's biography of the famous Athenian statesman Pericles. The same Pericles who, as we know, commissioned the building of the Parthenon. Plutarch's testimony is particularly revealing on the disease's impact on morale and social cohesion. It also raises questions about the role of leadership in times of crisis. Let us read a part of chapter 34. First, a picture of Pericles, who is very well represented in art. As Plutarch puts it, it was then that the plague first attacked and ravaged those who were in the vigorous prime of life. Afflicted in body and soul, the citizens were utterly enraged at Pericles, and like people who have been deranged by illness and who come to resent a doctor or a father, they tried to injure him. Persuaded by his enemies that the disease had been caused by bringing the throng of country folk into the city, where in the summer season, crowds of men were forced to lead a stay-at-home and idle life, huddled together in small houses and stifling huts, instead of the clean life they had previously lived out in the open. Pericles was held responsible, since on account of the war, he had poured masses of people from the country within the walls, and then provided no employment for that multitude, but allowed them, like penned cattle, to fill one another with pestilence and afforded them no change or relief. It is clear from Plutarch's text that the plague initiated a blame game in Athens directed against Pericles himself. This is a significant turn of events within the life itself, within its broader context. In the earlier sections of his narrative, Plutarch repeatedly stresses that Pericles was extremely popular as a leader and that he drew all classes of Athenians together with his eloquent rhetoric, which avoided the usual demagogic tricks of politicians. The plague, therefore, not only diminished Pericles' appeal, it also undermined the key role he played as an agent of unity within Athenian society. His enemies now exploited the situation in order to question his political decisions and credibility, and the Athenians started blaming him for their misfortune. These are all signs of social unrest, which show tears in the fabric of Athenian society. Plutarch's analogies are particularly revealing in this context, in the context of chapter 34 that I have just read. As we saw, he compares, he compares Pericles to a doctor or a father who is blamed when his patient or his child is ill. Illness in this context denotes not only physical disease, but also moral disease, whereby a person, overwhelmed by fear, blindly seeks a culprit for situations that he or she cannot control. Equally revealingly, Plutarch compares the population that Pericles moved from the countryside of Attica into the city of Athens with animals. This is here, yes. On one level, this analogy implies knowledge of how contagious diseases spread among flocks of domesticated animals. Like cattle, the Athenians were helpless against the spread of epidemic disease due to the concentration of a large population within a confined space, the city's walls. But the analogy also comments on a disturbing change of character. Forcibly deprived of the freedom they enjoyed as workers of the countryside, the Athenians were in a sense domesticated, that is, reduced to a dependent or passive state. In this respect as well, the harm they suffered affected not just their physical well-being, but also their mental state, their emotional and mental well-being. Again, I think it is worth sort of underscoring this analogy here. He provided no employment for that multitude, but allowed them, like penned cattle, to fill one another up with pestilence and afforded them no change or relief. In the final stretch of his life of Pericles, Plutarch tells us that Pericles himself died during the same plague. He is in fact the only one to tell us so, and this information does not appear in Thucydides. He describes the symptoms of Pericles' illness as follows. At that time, it would seem, the plague seized Pericles, not with an acute or severe attack, as it did others, but with a mild, lingering illness, attended by a variety of changes that gradually wasted his body and undermined his judgment. And he concludes later in 38, certainly Theophrastus in his Ethics, inquiring whether character changes in accordance with one's fortunes and abandons its excellence when shaken by the body's sufferings, records that Pericles showed one of his friends who came to visit him an amulet, that is a lucky charm, that the women had hung around his neck. By that, he intended to say that he was in terrible shape indeed, given that he put up with such silliness. Now, regarding the beginning of section 38, scholars question whether the Athenian plague was the actual cause of Pericles' death. His symptoms do not seem to match those of the other victims as described by Thucydides. Thucydides described a much more sudden onset of the symptoms of this peculiar disease. But we have no reason to question that for Plutarch, the plague was the cause of Pericles' death. In fact, as we saw, as he goes on to tell us, the plague put Pericles' character to the ultimate test. Particularly his mention of the amulet that Pericles wore is very suggestive. In the earlier sections of the life, Plutarch had praised Pericles' devotion to rational explanations of events. This was due to his training under the 5th century natural philosopher Anaxagoras. Given this, the lucky charm that he wears is a poignant comment on the Athenian plague's destabilizing effect. Such was the fear that it stirred, that this disease stirred, it even turned Pericles himself into a victim of religious superstition, yielding to the influence of the uneducated women who ran his household. The name of the peripatetic philosopher Theophrastus, which we see here on this slide, who is mentioned at the beginning of this subsection, invests this historical anecdote with deeper moral resonance. The question that Plutarch wants us, his readers, to ponder is this: how far can human character withstand adversity? This is a question that many other philosophers in later antiquity continue to pose on and on. As far as Plutarch's answer is concerned, and this is an answer that I should have added earlier, Plutarch writes in the late 1st, early 2nd century AD. For Plutarch, Pericles' example does not seem to leave much room for optimism. The last segment of my talk will be concerned with the social impact of the Antonine plague, the epidemic disease that struck the Roman world in the year 165 AD. The Antonine plague was the first great pandemic in history, and the evidence so far suggests that it was smallpox. It traveled to Europe from the Middle East via the troops of the Roman Emperor Lucius Verus, troops who were returning home from a campaign against the Parthians. The Parthians were a Persian kingdom which was on chronic conflict with the Roman Empire. Unlike the cases of mumps on Thasos, or even the Athenian plague that we examined earlier, the spread of this particular plague was not a local affair. On the contrary, aided by the vast expanse and connectivity of the Roman Empire, the disease reached every corner of the Roman world in a series of outbreaks. Its impact is widely attested in sources such as papyri from Egypt, inscriptions and archaeological evidence from various ancient cities, as well as from texts. For example, the Roman historian Cassius Dio tells us that as many as 2,000 people per day died of this disease in Rome itself, the imperial capital itself. It even drove Galen, antiquity's most famous physician and personal doctor to the imperial family, to flee Rome and to return to his home city of Pergamum, situated on the coast of Asia Minor. In this situation of fear and despair, people were vulnerable to exploitation. It seems that on this particular occasion, the motto, "Every crisis is an opportunity," is an accurate description for what went on. What kind of exploitation? The most eloquent testimony comes from the satirical author Lucian. Lucian was a man of Syrian descent who wrote in Greek. One of his most remarkable works is a satirical biography of a man called Alexander the False Prophet. This is the sort of the name he gives to his subject, his biographical subject. Alexander was a man from the coast of the Black Sea who founded a cult. It was a cult of a snake god. He was called Glycon. In his hometown, Abonuteikos, this is a town on the coast of the Black Sea, as I said. This snake deity, Glycon, was supposed to be a son of the god Apollo, and we know that the god Apollo was a healing god in antiquity, as well as an oracular god. He was the patron god, of course, of the Oracle of Delphi. Lucian consistently attacks the credentials of Alexander himself, hence the title Alexander the False Prophet. He also attacks his cult, which, however, seems to have been extremely popular. We know about this from many other sources. In the course of his attack, Lucian informs us of Alexander's actions during the Antonine plague. As he tells us, he sent oracle mongers to every part of the Roman Empire, warning the cities to watch out for plagues and conflagrations and earthquakes. He assured them that they could depend on his personal help to prevent any of these happening. He sent round an oracle to all the nations during the Great Plague, consisting of one line. Phoebus, with hair unshorn, averts the dark cloud of the plague. And you could see the line written over gateways everywhere as a charm against the plague, though in most cases it had the opposite effect, for by some chance, it was those houses especially which had the line inscribed on them that were emptied of their inhabitants. Don't imagine that I am suggesting that they perished because of the inscription. It just so happened by chance. Perhaps too many people were over-trustful in the verse, didn't take precautions, and lived too carelessly, not cooperating with the oracle in countering the disease, since they had the words to protect them and unshorn Phoebus to ward off the plague with his arrows. I should explain here that Phoebus is another name for the Greek god of healing, Apollo. Also, the formula hair unshorn is very typical. It's a very typical description of Apollo. He's depicted with long hair as a symbol of eternal youth. This is because Greek youths did not cut their hair, only when they became adults. Lucian's criticism has a dual target here. There's no doubt that Alexander the False Prophet sought to exploit the fear and disorientation caused by the Antonine plague for his personal benefit. Undoubtedly, the oracle of Apollo that he sent out to various cities would have enhanced his prestige as prophet and as cult founder. And it would, of course, have also translated into monetary gains, such as dedications and other privileges for the shrine that he founded back home. But he's not the only one to blame, according to Lucian. As he astutely remarks, Alexander's victims were gullible enough to entrust their health to an oracle inscribed on or above their doorposts, abandoning all precaution. This turned out to be deadly for many, as he notes. More broadly, Lucian's text reminds us of how new religious cults often rise and gain traction in response to moments of crisis. An epidemic disease is, of course, a moment of crisis par excellence. Although Lucian's negative biography of Alexander, the false prophet, is a fictional report, it is a fictional text, nevertheless, it is based on historical facts. The cult of the snake god Glycon is well attested in sources dated to the Roman Empire. For example, we find images, we find the god Glycon, the serpent, on Roman coins from this period. So this indicates that the cult was very widely spread. It was very popular. Another remarkable archaeological find, this one from the banks of the River Thames in London itself, even gives credence to Lucian's story about the existence and circulation of the Apollo oracle during the Antonine plague, the one we have just read about. The find in question is an amulet, a lucky charm, made of lead and inscribed with Greek letters. The letters, in fact, the inscription is a prayer in Greek. It looks unimpressive on this particular photo, yet a Greek inscription is indeed legible on it. It belonged to a man called Demetrios, who was a Greek speaker who lived in London in the 160s AD. Part of its prayer, which invokes several deities, some Greek, some Oriental, reads as follows: Phoebus of the unshorn hair, archer, drive away the cloud of plague. Lord God, watch over Demetrios. This text, this extract from the prayer that is inscribed on this amulet is almost identical to the Apollo oracle that Lucian cites in Alexander the False Prophet, as we saw just now. It seems then that Alexander's popularity reached even the westernmost frontier, westernmost and northernmost frontier of the Roman Empire, Britain, and that many people, like Demetrios, entrusted themselves to Apollo's promise of healing and protection. Their life during that time must undoubtedly have been full of horror and fear as they witnessed the inexorable progression of the Antonine plague, claiming more and more victims every day. After this tour of the sources, necessarily a select one, I would like to close by recommending two excellent books for those of you who wish to investigate these topics further. I have consulted both these books for my presentation today. They're both wonderful studies and very accessible. The first is by Kyle Harper, The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and the End of an Empire, published by Princeton University Press. And the second and most recent one, it is a book that I have already quoted from, Robin Lane Fox's The Invention of Medicine, From Homer to Hippocrates, published by Penguin. Thank you very much for your attention.